Welcome to the Struggle for Justice in Ukraine, a discussion about Russian crimes committed in Ukraine and options for accountability. We will be discussing the impact of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, practical options, and I stress the word practical options for justice in Ukraine, and also growing threats to justice in Ukraine and implications for peace and accountability over the past 3 months, well, since the 20th of January, I'll put it this way. So, welcome. Let me introduce our speakers. First, I hope we have Alexei Sivak, who is a human rights activist and expert on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. He is the founder and coordinator of the network of Ukrainian men who survived captivity and torture alumni, including survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And himself, he survived Russian captivity, and he is joining us from Kherson. Добрий день, пане Олексію. Okay.
Доброго дня.
Also here we have Christina Kit, who is chairwoman of Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association called URFEM, attorney at law and PhD in law, human rights defender. Sitting next to her is Charlotte Hogg, who is the founder and executive director of the All Survivors Project. She sits on this steering board of the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative in the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. And last but not least, we have Katerina Busol, who is a Ukrainian lawyer and an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla in Kyiv, and a British Academy Research Fellow at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. So, let's start. My first question would be to Christina about your organization, URFEM, which has been documenting and analyzing war crimes in Ukraine. What kind of crimes you have documented?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the question, and thank you for invitation, and thank you All Survivors Project for partnership with Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, URFEM. Our organization, we are working with sexual gender-based violence issues, and in our organization we first of all, we have analytical center who make different analytical research, prepare recommendation to our legislation, and try build in Ukraine gender-sensitive survivor-centered approach justice. If you talk about sexual gender-based violence cases, including conflict-related sexual violence. At the same time, we understand that it's very important strengthen capacity of law enforcement system and legal community in general who provide legal aid for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And of course, our organization, we unite female lawyers who provide legal assistance to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And if you talk about documentation, we don't document war crimes in general meaning, especially we provide legal assistance during investigation process and in the court, and survivors which want to report about conflict-related sexual violence and need legal support, they ask us about these services. Now we provide legal assistance to 83 survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. 43 of them it's female survivors, and 40 it's male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Currently, 13 cases are in the court, and we already have 3 verdicts convicted Russian military personnel for committing conflict-related sexual violence. Of course, very important for us analyze gender aspects of cases where we provide legal assistance because we try to understand different problems with access to justice which have survivors of CRSV, men and women. And I will talk today more about female survivors of CRSV because it's our mission of our organization to provide legal aid for these survivors first of all, but of course we are working with male survivors too. If you talk about women who suffered from conflict-related sexual violence, most civilian women experience conflict-related sexual violence in their homes during occupation, in a neighboring house where a Russian forcibly brought them, and for example in forests or when then crossing a Russian checkpoint. If you talk about women service members who were in captivity or about civilian women prisoners who experience conflict-related sexual violence, of course they suffered from this crime when they was in captivity. And if you talk about male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence who work with us, to whom we provide legal assistance, CRSV was committed in place of detention and captivity. For example, we provide legal aid for men from Kherson region and other regions in Ukraine.
And if I can jump in at this point, Christina, I'm sure many of you will know that sexual violence against men is institutionalized in the Russian penal system. It's been there for decades and generations. Yeah. It's been used against inmates. It's been used against people snatched off the street, political opponents. And as Russian prisoners and Russian security forces are expanding into Ukraine, of course, they bring this kind of practice to Ukraine as well. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, thank you. But if you talk about not only men, but about female survivors of CRSV, most of them are very stronger female activists who on different regions of Ukraine and who suffered of conflict-related sexual violence because they're very active person in their regions, and many of them, of course, was in the prisons and detention in the Russia, and we know some of them who died after torture and CRSV committed by Russian soldiers. And why, for me, very important talk about gender component and this gender aspects, because we, as a women's rights organization, we feel that we can lose female survivors in our focus if you talk about justice for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Because if we analyze all cases committed by Russian soldiers, we see that many human rights organizations who documenting war crimes cases, of course, they communicate with male and female survivors, but male survivors, in most cases, they was in captivity, and we can talk about group of persons who suffered from conflict-related sexual violence. But if you talk about female survivors, we have different aspects, and it's very important to understand this and try together as a legal community and international justice system understand how we can help them report about these cases and build this justice mechanism more gender sensitive and including a survivor-centered approach.
Let's talk to someone who experienced Russian captivity firsthand. Pane Oleksiyu, you've witnessed the impact of this war on real people, on real individuals. How does justice look to you? What can be achieved in terms of justice?
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Хотел в первую
At
очередь
first, I would
поблагодарить
like to
организаторов,
thank organizers
в первую очередь
and
Cheru
Cheru Hog, who
постоянно
always
очень сильно нас
support us
поддерживает
really a
в
lot.
этом вопросе. Видел,
I witnessed and I
я и
still
сейчас вижу, я
see,
живу
I
в
live in
Херсоне,
Kherson,
и
and
даже сейчас я уже приехал
even
в
though
Киев, но
now I'm
вчера
in Kyiv,
еще готовился
but
к этому
yesterday evening I
мероприятию у
was
себя
preparing to
дома.
this event
И
back at
если в
home.
новостях пишут про
And if
перемирие,
news are
то я
talking
готовился к пуску
about
снарядов
some peace
в
negotiations, so I
соседних
was
районах.
preparing, listening to
Грубо
sheltering,
говоря, сейчас
to shelling
вопрос
and explosion
жизни в
in
Херсоне.
neighboring districts. That is the reality of life in
То,
Kherson.
что я видел в
What I saw
оккупации,
during occupation,
там не было
there
никакой
was
ни
no
справедливости, никакого
justice at
правосудия.
all.
Людей
People
просто
were
могли
just
хватать на
abducted from
улицах.
streets.
Я могу
And
говорить
I
только
can be
про
talking
города,
only about
как
cities,
сказала
as
Кристина.
Christina said.
В
In
селах это
villages,
было
it was
намного
even
хуже,
worse
потому что, опять же, это были
because there
войска,
were
солдаты.
troops, soldiers.
Так как у нас есть проект
As
промежуточных
we now
прав,
have this
сейчас
project
показывает
of
большая часть
interim
человеки
reparations, and we can
обращаются.
see that the majority
Я всегда говорю, что человеки не больше
are
пострадали.
men.
Есть и женки.
But I
У
always
нас
say
очень много
that
территорий,
it's not
которые
that
страдало,
men survived
которые оккупированы. Мы
more
многих
or
их людей
suffered
знаем.
more.
И,
It was
к
just
сожалению, у
different.
человеков тоже
And
разное было, и
male survivors
они
also
не готовы говорить.
experience
Сейчас как бы
something they are not ready to talk
приняли
about.
благодаря нашей
Thanks
менеджере
to
то, что СНПК
our
это часть
network,
структуры,
they accepted the
и
thought
они
that
открываются с этой стороны.
contact-related
Они
sexual violence is a part
понимают,
of
что было
torture,
преступление,
and
и
they are
готовы
ready to
говорить,
open in
готовы
this
ни о чем не
aspect.
жалеть.
They are ready to talk that this crime had happened to them.
Справедливость тут
And
справедливость
about
для каждых
justice,
людей, наверное, она
for every
индивидуальна.
individual, it
Для
will
нас,
be
хотя бы небольшая
individual.
справедливость
For
в
us,
том, что Россия
it
должна
will
заплатить
be
за
when
свои
Russia pays
преступления
for the
и заплатить не
crimes.
только это имеется в
And
виду
when I say
финансовая
pay, I
часть,
don't mean only
а
financial
заплатить должна во
aspect.
всех
I mean
аспектах.
all and every aspect.
Ну, как
The very
минимум,
least
преступник должен быть назван
criminal has
преступником.
to be
К
named a
сожалению,
criminal.
для меня,
And
к сожалению,
unfortunately,
я надеюсь, конечно,
I
я
want to be
ошибаюсь, но
mistaken, but
мировое правосудие,
international
видимо,
justice, for me
для меня,
personally,
я являюсь тем показателем,
I'm
в
just example that
2022
in
году мировое
2022,
правосудие
international justice
просто не работало.
wasn't working.
Ну, справедливость должна
Justice
строиться на морали.
must be built
Мораль это то, что
on
когда
moral.
ничего, когда ни государства, ни
But when
политики, ни
there
полиции,
is
тогда вступают какие-то
no state, no
то, что я видел
police,
и
nothing,
пережил,
then we talk
не было
about
никакой
morale.
морали.
But what I saw, there was
Лично меня ломали и
nothing
уничтожали
humane
не
about
как
it.
человека,
They
даже
tried to
не знаю,
break me,
как-то,
they tried
не
to
как
destroy
животных.
me, not even as a human.
Даже у нас есть
We have an
инициатива
initiative
по внесению
on
России
putting Russia
в
to
в
a
список
shame
врагов,
list,
shame-list так
so-called.
называемый. Ну, это,
Yeah,
да, это
this is
адвокационная
advocacy
программа.
program,
Это
but
наш
it is
крик
our
переживших,
cry
крик мировому
of us
сообществу.
survivors to
Справедливость
international
должна
communities that
наступить, и что
justice has to
хотя
come,
бы мир
and the
наконец-то
world
должен назвать
must
агрессора
name
агрессором.
aggressor and aggressor.
И в этом, я могу
I can be
рассказывать десятки историй, в
talking
принципе, как и Кристина, которая
about
тоже знает
dozens of stories,
десятки
and I'm
историй.
sure
Я могу
Christina knows them as well.
как общаться
I
и
can
что
tell
переживает
you
мать
what it
цивильного
feels
человека,
like talking to a mother of a
просто
civilian
до
who
смерти
was beaten
забили
to death in
всеми
captivity
возможными способами, возможно, и
by
было
all
и СНПК.
existing
Потом, как
means,
животное,
and
просто
he was
закопали
later just
на
buried
дороге,
somewhere
его через
near the
8
road, and
месяцев
only
только
after
нашла.
8 months
Благодаря
our mother was
оккупации
able to
и
find his
вследствие
body, and
собственной
only due
агрессии.
to the occupation.
Я также
And I also
могу
can
вам
tell
рассказать,
you
как общаться
how
с
it
женой
feels
цивильного
talking
человека, которого в 22
to a wife of a civilian who was abducted in 2022, and she still doesn't know where he is. And when some civilians are released from captivity, we try to find out where he might be. I can share my story with you, but they all will be just stories, and I would really love to be discussing real steps towards justice. World, as I believe, is facing huge changes, and we just have to take this step forward. We, as a network, we decided to act, and we call others to act as well.
Thank you, Alexei. Charo, you understand, lead the only organization that addresses specifically conflict-related violence against men. What have you seen happening in Ukraine?
Well, thanks so much, Vitaly. And before I sort of talk about what's happening in Ukraine, I have to acknowledge that our information and our knowledge comes from those who suffered it. So thank you, Alexei, for partnering with us and sharing these very painful realities, which help us and advocate with you and alongside you. Thank you. And thank you also to my co-panelists for being here today, and also to Chatham House, and you, most of all, Vitaly, for agreeing to moderate this very difficult discussion. What do we see in Ukraine today? So let's talk about it from different dimensions. Let's talk about the figures. So as far as we know, Ukraine has the highest number of documented cases of conflict-related sexual violence against men in the world. This is not to say that it hasn't happened in other contexts, but certainly the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, in their latest report, which covered the period March 2023 to August 2024, noted that 68% of the victims they had spoken to were men. What forms does it take? It takes numerous forms. It takes the form of genital mutilation, castration, fears of genital mutilation, rape, threats of rape, forced nudity, electrocution of genitals, beating of genitals, you name it, and the perversity knows no bounds. Why is it done? What is the reason and rationale behind it? It is done because it is one weapon that the perpetrator has to really break an individual. And this brings me to the other impacts, because it is not just about an impact on one person, the person who's in front and being beaten to death. It impacts the man, it impacts his partner, his family, and through it, it impacts the next generation, and it breaks the community. So that is why it is such a powerful tool, and that is why it is deployed. What are we seeing in Ukraine in terms of who is being affected? We're seeing, as Christina has shared, civilians who are in occupied territories, who are picked up for no reason at all, and sometimes for reason which is in the minds of the perpetrators. We're seeing this inflicted as a systematic weapon of torture, according to the Commission of Inquiry in Ukraine in its most recent report, which has just been released in April. It is widespread and systematic in detention sites and inflicted against prisoners of war. Again, what is the logic behind it? Why is it used? Because it is such a powerful tool. Tomorrow, when the war ends, you will have a community, a country of people who have been destroyed from within. And it will take a lot to rebuild this community, rebuild the life of each man one by one. So, I mean, it's basically a very quick sketch of what's going on in Ukraine.
We just heard Alexei say that international justice is not working. And as you will know, Katerina, the perpetrators, almost all of them, are in Russia or in occupied parts of Ukraine, i.e. out of reach. You know how international justice works. You know how international law is applicable to Ukraine. What are the options?
Justice is served not only in courts, and although I will dedicate the first part of my response to explaining how Ukraine has acted upon the prosecution of various international crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence, I would stress how Ukraine has been exemplary in introducing urgent interim reparations, the program which has already been mentioned today, and also how Ukraine is documenting these atrocities for wider purposes, for the purposes of building a nuanced narrative about not just the types of Russia's atrocities, but also Russia's motives and the legacies of these atrocities. As you mentioned, this is especially torture by means of sexual violence is something which is inherent in Russia's law enforcement, in Russia's military. We have seen that in Georgia, in Chechnya, in the use of Russian service persons across the African continent, but also we have seen that done by the Red Army. In terms of the criminal proceedings, Ukraine, since the full-scale invasion, has had a designated unit within its Office of the Prosecutor General to act upon conflict-related sexual violence. It's headed by a female prosecutor. It has both male and female investigators and prosecutors, meaning that survivors have a choice of professionals in terms of their gender who they would like to engage with. And to my surprise, oftentimes male survivors actually prefer to speak to female investigators, prosecutors, or lawyers who assist them throughout the proceedings. In terms of urgent interim reparations, this scheme was introduced specifically for survivors of sexual violence, and it's innovative in certain dimensions. First, it emphasizes that Ukraine has had victims of international crimes since 2014, not only since the full-scale invasion, and this scheme, unlike some other support schemes, is available to the victims who have been assaulted since the beginning of Russia's aggression. Second, for the first time, it also recognizes children born out of sexual violence, children born out of rape, as victims in terms of the procedure and in terms of their rights to claim reparations. Also, what's important is that urgent interim reparations, they help us understand the needs of survivors, and if anything, they incentivize more survivors to come forward. So, for instance, if the number of criminal proceedings was around 400, if I'm not mistaken, currently the number of persons who applied for urgent interim reparations as of December 2024 was more than 600, and the majority of applicants were men. So we also see how the outreach to the victims, how the explanation that when they share their experience, how that it can help them get medical support, psychological support, couple counseling. It helps survivors come forward. And also through the reparations program, which is what's also very important, we have not just lawyers being engaged. We see paralegal professionals, we see psychologists, so we see a broader spectrum of persons who work with survivors, helping them not only share, but first and foremost identify their trauma. Because oftentimes men who were forced to watch sexual abuse of their female relatives, and this is a very common method of atrocity employed by the Russians, they don't actually realize that they are also survivors. They're survivors of sexual mental torture, and they also are entitled to reparations. And just not to take over the mic, I would stress that, again, while it's so admirable that Ukraine and its international partners support this two-pronged action through prosecutions and reparations on atrocity crimes, including male and female sexual violence, there has been the wider aperture within the Ukrainian civil society and victims community to say that we need to document this for the broader audience. Just passing the library today at the Chatham House, I saw the book by Victoria Amelina, Looking at Women, Looking at War. She was the writer and a mother who turned into a documentator of war crimes, and she knew that what she records might not necessarily fit into the specific dossier for the criminal proceedings, but it's the truth that ends up there for the wider public to know about Russia's atrocities. So this is the compilation of all these actions which contribute to the wider sense of justice. And she was killed last summer in Kramatorsk by a Russian missile, yes.
So justice takes time.
So justice takes time. And she was killed last summer in Kramatorsk by a Russian missile, yes. So justice takes time. And she was killed last summer in Kramatorsk by a Russian missile, yes. So justice takes time. And she was killed last summer in Kramatorsk by a Russian missile, yes.
So justice takes time.
Justice takes time and it takes many forms, but thanks to amazing people who have been through horrific experience, but they speak out and they fight, we see it being happening. We have seen the special tribunal for the Russian leadership and their crime of aggression being established and moving forward, and we will see the next steps as well.
Does that work for you, Alexei, justice taking time? When I interviewed the former Ukrainian Prosecutor General Kostyan here in London, I asked him, well, you're making efforts to get the ball rolling, but what about the people who are experiencing it now, who are traumatized now? So that's the question that's big in everyone's mind. Is that how you feel, Alexei, given that currently bringing those people to justice isn't really realistic?
For us, it's one of our first steps toward justice. That was recognition of what happened to us. Also, this small amount of money, I mean interim reparations, it was a really good support. And as experience showed, people spent it differently, and this experience, it was worked just like a word of mouth. Somebody got this support and shared with somebody who was doubtful. And I'm talking only about male survivors. But when we talk about justice, justice, it's accountability, responsibility, and I believe Russia must be held accountable for each and every crime committed.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Katerina, about the changing environment for justice globally, and specifically when it comes to Ukraine after the second coming of Donald Trump. As you will know, many projects dealing with international justice, investigations and research have been defunded. What impact has it had on Ukraine, or what impact do you envisage it will have on Ukraine?
Well, the second coming of the Trump administration has impacted the justice landscape not only for Ukraine, but globally. We know that there is the second set of sanctions by the Trump administration against the International Criminal Court and its Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, and the ICC conducts the investigation and prosecution, among other situations, also into the situation of Ukraine. The suspension of the activities of the US aid has been really detrimental for Ukraine's human rights sector, because just a lot of work on the documentation and analysis of conflict-related atrocities has been funded by US aid programs. The Trump's administration's wider disengagement with international multilateral institutions, for instance, the more complete withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council, also has its repercussions not only globally but with respect to Ukraine, because the UN Commission of Inquiry mentioned by my co-panelist is being established, and then its mandate is being extended by the Human Rights Council, not only for Ukraine, for other contexts, for Sudan, for Palestine, for many other contexts. So we do see this impact necessarily. And of course, we know that the Yale monitoring lab that tracked the deportation of Ukrainian children was for a certain period defunded, it meant that even the existing data about the tracking essentially the deported Ukrainian children could be lost. Luckily, it has been reported that for a certain period of time, the functioning of the platform was resumed so that they could at least do the data transferring, but there is no continuation of this tracking, and obviously the maintenance of the digital platforms costs a lot of money, and this has been a very big lesson for us domestically, both for the prosecution and human rights NGOs, because we understood that we need to diversify both the location of our servers, where we preserve our documented and documented atrocities and their analysis, and also the sources of funding for the maintenance of this software and hardware. So the impact has been immense, and certain type of work, it cannot just be done without the funding. If certain analytical work, legal analysis can be done pro bono, securing secure cars and patrols to go to the recently deoccupied territories and speak to survivors does require the money, and this has been the case. So we're really hoping that the European partners and other partners will step up and continue supporting the human rights NGOs in Ukraine, which have done amazing work, and Prosecutor Kostin has been particularly vocal in saying and in developing strategies of the Prosecutor General's Office collaboration with the civil society, because without civil society documentation and support of survivors, of whom they have the principal trust, the prosecutions will not move at the pace they're moving now.
Christina, Charo, have you felt the impact? What are the options?
I think very valid points have been made in terms of documentation and access to justice, but the real blow is going to come in and has come in terms of humanitarian access and the kind of mental health and physical health support that survivors need in order to engage appropriately and ethically with the justice process. You cannot expect a country which is under so much trauma to be able to, the survivors of violence in this country, to be able to participate in justice processes unless they have access to health and support. And I think for us, All Survivors Project, the funding has huge implications on the humanitarian side and the engagement of survivors and the support that survivors need. Indeed, the whole process of reparations, and I'm sure, Alexei, you would want to talk more about the reparations issues and the implications of reparations as they are being unfolded and what is going to happen with the lack of funding. So I would really like to hand over the floor to Alexei on this.
Alexei?
Так, по сути, проблема
Actually,
нынче у всех одна, это финансирование.
we all have the same problem now, funding.
Было предусмотрено выплата 500
Under this interim project reparation, 500 people were supposed to get this money, and then the law was written, but the problem is now, when there is this transitional period, people are still coming. There are more than 800 applications to the project of interim reparations, and at this stage, if I'm not mistaken, they can, only 650 can receive, and then the funding is over, and this transitional period, it can really affect trust of survivors. Those who already received, they're spreading this word of mouth, and people are coming, people are starting to trust. It is very difficult to gain this trust, and it's very easy to lose it. And now we are on a brink of losing trust of survivors, and it will be extremely difficult to try gain it again. I hope I answered your question.
Who's paying these reparations, Charo?
So there's a process that has been started by Global Survivors Fund, and it's being funded by different governments in order to roll out.
Not Russia.
Not by Russia, no.
I want to add a few words about this project. Katarina and Alexei mentioned about urgent interim reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. It's a pilot project established by Global Survivors Fund last year together with our government, according to agreement between Global Survivors Fund and our Vice Prime Minister of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And it's a very good model which show how government can build a partnership with civil society organization and international organization and implement very quality mechanism for survivors of CRSV if you talk about reparation for them. This year, U.S. Government had to support this project by, of course, Trump's decision influence on this, and now we don't have, I mean, Global Survivors Fund don't have enough resources continuing this project, and they we together now with international organization and Ukrainian government try fundraise for this project. But I want to add, if you talk about reparation mechanism for survivors of CRSV, it's one part of justice for them, because if you talk about justice, I mean, as a legal community, of course, usually we talk about verdicts, investigation process, etc. But it's not enough for people who suffered from conflict-related sexual violence. We have to think how we can build reparation mechanism for them, how we can build gender-sensitive and survivor-centered environment around them, and how we can guarantee for them justice, of course, on the national and international level. And if you talk about national level, usually I say that we do our work every day, but we have a big question how we can do our work on the international level, because we as a lawyer, for example, in Ukraine, we cannot guarantee our survivors of CRSV justice on the international level, yes, because usually they ask us about different international mechanism, how work ICC, how work other international agency, and if perpetrators will held accountable for all these atrocities. But at the same time, for them, very important, feel very sensitive approach from state authorities on the national level, and build and have this referral mechanism when they get any services. If you talk about rehabilitation, medical support, psychological support, if you talk about trauma-oriented approach in communication between state authorities and survivors of CRSV. It's our task now in Ukraine, and our civil society organization and state authorities work on this. And but next question, yes, what we will do together on the international level, and how we can guarantee this people some satisfaction on the international level, not only on the national level.
Can you answer that question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Question for me.
What can be done on the international level?
It's a very complicated question, but I think how we work in Ukraine. First of all, for us, very important, involve in this process survivors of CRSV. For example, we have in Ukraine interagency working groups, different expert groups, when survivors of CRSV are members of this process. And it's very important for us hear what they want, yes, and involve them to justice process in general. They have to be part of different negotiations process. As if you talk about peace building process now and different discussions around peace, etc., etc., I worry that we don't have enough conversation or discussion about human rights. And we talk about stop war, I don't know, any territories, etc., but we don't talk about people and justice for them. I mean, it's leaders of different countries, US, European countries. Of course, our president always mentioned about justice and responsibility for perpetrators, but we have to remember always about people and recovery for them and how we can guarantee this.
Charu, with all that's going on around the world, so many conflicts, we've got India and Pakistan now, Gaza, do you feel that those looking at Ukraine, they have to compete for attention as well as funds in the new reality?
I mean, there certainly is a lot of donor fatigue with all that's going on, and there's a lot of reluctance to engage with different contexts. And we also find, in this new sort of changing scenario, new governments, new combinations of governments are coming forward as peacemakers, peace builders, negotiators, go-betweens. So it is totally in a situation of flux. Is Ukraine losing out because of what's happening globally? I think the position that Ukraine occupies and the fact that it's sort of on the cusp of Europe and the fact that it has received such a lot of political attention because of what has happened with the United States ensures that there is this, hopefully, constant support to make Ukraine a test case where it's good over evil, a triumph of justice over aggression, and hopefully that feeling will be sustained, that Ukraine cannot be allowed to lose this space. But I think it's not a question of just who wins or loses, but the people in Ukraine who are really suffering all the time and what a chance they get to rebuild their lives. Because I think in this moment of crisis and war, there is also a moment of opportunity where, institutions, just simple processes like we work with informed consent processes and we find that there is an utter disregard for these processes, that the words survivor-centered, trauma-informed are used but never really employed. They have become buzzwords that are fashionable to include in your project proposals, but when it comes to the real essence of standing by the survivor, they're never really, put into action. So I think this is not about internationals getting involved. This is about Ukraine to sort it out themselves and think that this is an opportunity for them to really get this straight, for them to do the right thing by their people. So justice is a process. Justice is not just criminal justice. Justice is about reparations, memorialization, truth-telling. It's about recognition, non-repetition. So there's so many things which are embroiled in this concept of justice, and it is so individual. It is for each person to determine whether they want to come out and speak about the violence, whether they want to stay silent about it. So I think it really boils down to how every individual can contribute in a way that is fitting for them in this whole justice project.
Thank you, Charu. Well, at this point, I'll throw the floor open to your questions, and we'll take questions from this room and also from our online audience. Your question, sir.
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah, coming.
Yeah, I find what you said not surprising, but still depressing. And I am concerned that the international community, particularly the other side of the pond, wants a short-term fix and will very easily drop the cases of the children and those that have been abused at the drop of a hat. And I don't want to be too depressing, but I think that's probably the reality of it. Now, how one gets round that problem is the challenge. And if you look at, let's say, the result of the Balkans, Srebrenica, Kosovo, Serbia, the international community really didn't excel themselves in hunting down known perpetrators. Some got caught, but a lot didn't. And I fear that sort of fatigue will set in. And I genuinely hope it doesn't happen. And I pray it doesn't happen. But I think that is the reality. How do we motivate the European, and let's be honest, we're not, the Americans aren't going to be interested. You know, America first is they can't even look after their own people who are being abused and punished. And so to suggest that Trump or J.D. Vance or anybody else will show a minuscule concern as to what happened in Ukraine. Similarly, I can't see Putin agreeing to any settlement unless he and all his Russian perpetrators get an unconditional pardon. I hope I'm wrong. I am genuinely a pessimist, I'm told by my friends and my colleagues. But I suspect I would be surprised if the views I've just expressed are not shared by everybody in this room.
Well, let's ask Alexei. I saw you nod as you heard this question, Alexei. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Я хотел бы сказать,
I
что
would
ни
like
один
to
депрессивный человек в этом зале.
just to say that you're not the
Тоже
only
друзья часто об
depressed
этом говорят.
person in this room.
Ну, я
My
бы
friends
хотел
also
бы
tell me
скорее
this, but
ни плохо, ни хорошо
I'd
сказать.
rather want
И
to say,
я просто часто говорю, что
I just often
меня
say
все же освободила
that
не
I
политика,
was deliberated
и тут я и хотел
not
бы
by
поблагодарить,
politics,
конечно, и
but
весь мир, и мировое сообщество за
of
помощь
course I want
именно в
to
оружии.
thank
Меня
the whole
освободило
international
оружие
community
и
for help,
парни, которые
especially with
шли,
weapon.
освобождали город.
I was
Я просто
deliberated
из
by
тех
Ukrainian
людей,
soldiers
которые
who
меня
made
должны
Kherson
были
free
вывести.
again.
То есть
I
меня
was
вот готовили,
supposed to
машина,
be
уже дверь была
taken
открыта, я
to
должен был
Russian
туда сесть.
territory.
И
The
я бы
car
просто
was
уехал
like
куда-то
ready,
туда. Не факт бы, что
and I was
вообще
supposed to
кто-то про
be
меня что-то
taken
еще
somewhere,
узнал бы.
and
Поэтому я
there is
просто
no guarantee
хотел
somebody
поддержать
would ever hear
человека,
about me
который
again.
думает, что он все плохо думает.
So I just want to support the
И в
person
то же
who
время
believes
хотел
that
выразить благодарность.
he is very pessimistic. And once again, I want to express my gratitude.
I would like to make a couple of perhaps a bit boring legal remarks. Just international law is very clear that first, international crimes do not allow for the period of limitations. That is why we still have proceedings in Australia or elsewhere globally against the Nazis who are in their 90s at the moment. And also international law does not allow amnesties for international crimes. So whatever might be written in a deal might not stand the test of international law and will be null and void. And for instance, if we look at the experience of Latin American nations and military juntas there, many of the governments did introduce amnesties for themselves or for their subsequent or for their predecessors, but then they were invalidated by the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, and they were eventually invalidated by the new democratic governments. So I share your concern, but I think it's important for Ukraine to stress where international law stands, and also to see the very intricate but very clear safeguards that we see international community and international bodies introduce. For instance, the UN Commission of Inquiry, again, on Ukraine, mentioned quite a few times today during the discussion, has said that no lasting peace can be achieved when victims do not receive justice in all its dimensions. The UN Commission of Inquiry, as well as the Special Commission of the Council of Europe on Human Rights, speak about the human rights dimension of the just peace for Ukraine. If we look at the recently, not fully established, but progressed special tribunal on the crime of aggression, just this past Friday, the Council of Europe has put a short, frequently asked questions section on their website regarding the tribunal, and they also stress that these accountability initiatives might not be interfered with by the peace negotiations. So first, the international law is very clear that no amnesties will be allowed for the crimes we discussed today. And second, the international community and the Council of Europe and the EU, they're putting more and more emphasis on the certain conditions which might not hopefully be agreed upon in the deal.
Thank you. And we have started receiving questions from our online audience. for example, from Yusuf Brookhouse, who's asking, at the risk of being massively reductive, why is the use of sexual violence as a tool of war seemingly so prevalent in the Russian military? I have attended several talks where this comes up again and again, and I think it's a very good question. I've been following Russia for all my life, really, and if you look at the language, the imagery, the memes, the jokes associated with the police, the KGB, the NKVD, the military, rape, sexual violence is always there as a threat, as a tool, as something you can use against your inmates, your opponents. Any views?
It's part of their DNA. You know, you look at the behaviour of the Russians during the last war. You know, the same crimes, the same.
Let's hear from the audience, from the panel. Kristin.
My opinion about this, if you talk about sexual violence as a weapon during the war, it's very, I think why they, of course, they did this during all wars, Second World Wars and other wars, because if you want to destroy all community, if you want isolate people who suffer from violence and sexual violence, it's very easy when you committed sexual violence, because this violence is against our dignity. And when you suffer from sexual violence, you don't, after that, you don't want to communicate with your family, with your relatives. You think only about some isolation. Sometimes for you, it's very complicated to communicate with other people. It means this violence, if this violence committed against 10 people, this influence on all communities and on all nations. And it's very, this instrument, they committed this violence very concrete, and they know that if they, for example, they located in small town or small village, and when they committed sexual violence against few persons, they know that other person will afraid them, and after that they will have more power on all this community and influence on all of these people.
Sharon?
Completely, I agree with Christina. It's a very potent tool, because inflicting sexual violence on a person who's been deprived of liberty is a very powerful way in which you can control their mind. They're completely within your control, and recovery from the psychological harm takes a very long time. But I'd like to take a step away from the question and talk about, the perpetration of sexual violence in situations of detention globally. Some of you may recall Manfred Novak's study on deprivation of liberty of children, which it was released in 2019, and it covered situations of both conflict and non-conflict settings, and therefore covered situations of administrative detention as well. And this showed that 95% of children who are detained in conflict settings are boys. So why is this? So there is a gender bias at work when it comes to the number and kind of people who find themselves in detention. And then what happens in detention? Complete control. And there is abuse, not just by those who are the law enforcement authorities in charge of detention sites, but by inmates as well. There is load of documentation on what happens in US prisons, particularly targeting people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity in these detention settings. So definitely there is a case to be made about Russian behavior in detention sites, but it is a global phenomena. And indeed, in our work, we find that deprivation of liberty, it creates specific risks and vulnerabilities for men and boys, which are heightened with age, with sexual orientation and gender identity, with ethnicity, religion. So you will see a load of intersectional factors which are at play in determining who gets abused and how in detention settings.
Yeah, of course, it's a very important point to make that the use of sexual violence is by no means limited to this war, specifically because it's such a powerful tool. Katerina, just briefly.
Very briefly on how Russia's perception of gender roles is very rigid. Russia decriminalized essentially domestic violence during COVID, saying that this is not an issue. Dedovshchina, including the use of sexual violence, and Dedovshchina in the abuse of service persons within the Russian army with respect to both male and females by their own service persons, is widespread. And what has been particularly poignant to me was the use of a gendered sexual violence related slur by President Putin when at the beginning of 2022 the world leaders visited Moscow trying to dissuade Putin from invading Ukraine on a larger scale. And Putin said that Ukraine has to comply with the Minsk agreements. My duty, it's your duty. Нравится, не нравится, терпи, моя красавица, which in the Russian connotation clearly referred to rape. And we had the head of state, who's also the head of the army, who makes an explicit rape joke. Doesn't it endorse its service persons on the ground? It does.
More questions, please.
Then I'll try to speak quietly into the mic. Hi, my name is Kat. I'm a master's student at KCL of War Studies. Very poignant. I come from a mixed background, born in Russia, dad's Ukrainian Jewish, mom's Georgian. So as you can imagine, the dinners get quite fun and very sad. I grew up with many discussions about what happened with my mom's childhood when she was 17 and Russia invaded Georgia in the 90s. After 3 aircraft with civilian children are shot down in Abkhazia, women are raped en masse. Nothing was done. I ask people who go to prestigious institutions of where they study or think tanks from here to the United States, when I ask them about, do you know what happened in the 90s or what things took place in 2008? The answer I get is, I don't know. I go on social media, Twitter being the bane of my existence, but part of my job, or Facebook comment sections, and the sheer hatred, like utter hatred that I see for Ukraine, for a variety of reasons that I will not bore listing out, is en masse. And the Russian propaganda machine is able to target absolutely everything. And the Western response is slow. Narrative was mentioned, and the importance for Ukraine to be able to actually take control of the narrative, to talk about what is happening. But would you agree or disagree that more potentially could be done by a lot of Western states, where we can forget about Trump's America at this time because he doesn't care, but by, let's say, European countries and the United Kingdom to actually, try to form a narrative among the population that lives within that is becoming increasingly hostile, from my personal experience and my observations on social media, toward Ukrainians, viewing them as ungrateful welfare queens and undeserving of any further attention as a bare minimum for victims of sexual violence that has been the focus of this discussion. Sorry for the long question.
Chara, would you like to take that one?
I think the narrative has not been helped by the obvious positions that have been taken by Western donors in terms of the treatment of Ukraine and other contexts. So I think the narrative has not been helped by that. But I say this many a time: compassion is not finite. Every victim of crime deserves justice, access to remedies. How do we change this narrative? I think we change this narrative by humanizing it and by ensuring that there is a recognition of other crimes that are being inflicted as well, including by the Ukrainians. So I think that will help that narrative in sort of fomenting or preventing this issue of Ukrainian exceptionalism, which has got into the discourse.
Thank you. At the very back, lady, please. If you could introduce yourself and keep your question brief.
Yes, brief, I shall do. My name's Jen Stout. I'm a journalist from Scotland. I'm so thankful that someone mentioned Victoria Amelina. If we keep talking about her and her work, then she's never really gone. And one thing that she often said to me was about impunity. So if we're looking at why the Russians have behaved in this way, and it's a question we could all grapple with till the end of time, yes, it's a useful weapon. Yes, it's about their culture. I think if we start talking about DNA, then we're going down a very dangerous and frankly unscientific route. But it's the culture, but it's so much about impunity. And that's the thing that Vika was always saying, and that she would have been writing in her brilliant book had they not killed her and left us with a bunch of fragments, which is still very much worth reading. I really want to... I'm looking at the bigger picture of this, the international law picture. Victoria would say there was no Nuremberg for Soviet crimes. And now if there's no prosecution, if there's no justice for Ukraine, is there any meaningful international law left? Are we destroying that whole system that was set up post-war? I really worry we are, by looking at it as an issue just for Ukraine. Or wouldn't it be good if Ukraine could have justice? Actually, this is all of our issues, but particularly Europeans, I think. I wonder if we can find any hope in Europe. I mean, all the pressure is now on Europe to fund this process for the special tribunal. Is Europe going to step up quickly and properly, do you think?
Katarina, you are an expert in international law.
I would like to remark that the approach of Ukraine as government, as the civil society and as a victims community has been to say that we are fighting not only for ourselves, but to the wider sense of justice. So for instance, the arguments about double standards, about Ukraine asking for the special tribunal and gradually getting it, and others issues of aggression not being addressed, Ukraine has approached with the position that Ukraine supports the reform of the International Criminal Court, which has been disabled to prosecute Russia's aggression because of the position of the powerful nations of the US, of Britain and France. But Ukraine supports the twofold approach. Ukraine supports the special tribunal because it might be quicker and it might be what is called a transitional building block to reform in the ICC, to ensure that justice for the crime of aggression is more universal than it's currently possible under the Rome Statute. As regards the special tribunal, I would level our expectations exactly because so far it's a largely European project. It will not most likely be able to waive the immunities of the so-called Troika, the head of state, the head of government, the head of the MFA of Russia, including, of course, President Putin, while they're still holding their offices. If it were a fully international tribunal, it would be able to do this. It doesn't mean that the prosecution of aggression would be futile. It would mean that it will first go perhaps after the not low-level perpetrators, but the people who are a little bit lower than the president and, as I mentioned, the head of government and the head of the MFA, and hopefully preparing the investigations. And when there is the change in Russia, or when the mentioned persons, including President Putin, don't hold their offices anymore, that they can be further prosecuted and get their judgment in the new tribunal.
We've got an important question, I think, from Claudia Palla, who's asking about stigma in Ukraine, which can be especially strong for male victims who might not feel safe or supported enough to speak out. And I think this question is best answered by our visitors from Ukraine. Are there any efforts in Ukraine to tackle this kind of stigma, like public education or awareness campaigns aimed at changing societal attitudes? Christina?
Yes, of course. If you talk about stigmatization of survivors of sexual violence in general, not only conflict-related sexual violence, because if you talk about stigma against people who suffer from violence, usually it's a situation with connect not only with war crimes. If we, for example, have if people who suffered from sexual violence as an ordinary crime feel stigma, they will not report about conflict-related sexual violence because they will know that community and society don't understand them and usually talk about that you are guilty, etc. But if we will show now how survivors of conflict-related sexual violence create their own organization and share their experience of sexual violence and reported about this violence, we can say that situation in stigma in Ukraine changed very quickly, and not only Ukrainian society but our government change every day, change our mechanism and try build very sensitive services for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. We have a lot of informational campaign, informational materials, study program for prosecutor, investigators, legal community in general. And we did a lot of work during this last 3 years and during this war. And I think our example of Ukrainian people who suffer from war crimes and example of our governments can show us how that we can be more positive if we talk about justice for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. I am not pessimist, it's true. And if you talk about hope and if you talk about justice, usually we thinking what we as a lawyer can do every day. For example, in 2022, in February, when Russian attacks our countries and city, we together with our lawyers organize a lot of online events during breakouts and in dangerous situation, and teach each other how work with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. We thought how we can implement new strategy during investigation process. We thought how we can change our policy. We updated our Women's Peace and Security and Gender City 25 in 2022. We did a lot of tasks and a lot of work which we had to do according to our knowledge, because we are lawyers. It means that we have enough skills, enough knowledge, do our work every day. And we are, for example, I am not international lawyer. My colleagues are not international lawyers. In 2022, we started teach international law, new policies, etc., etc. It means that we, as a people, create our agency, our policy, our institutions. We as a people are responsible for, of our mechanism which we implement. It means that only we as a people can do something new according to our skills and knowledge. It means that it's our power do this, yes? Who can do this, as we don't say that we are pessimist or etc. Yes.
Charo, briefly.
Yeah, just to say that, it's small acts of resistance in terms of countering stigma. And just the fact that we have Alexei and a group of brave men who come out and stand for this and say no more, we will not tolerate it. They're changing social norms by just standing out there. We don't see this in many contexts. It's quite unique to Ukraine that there is an acknowledgement, within the policy circles, within the practical way in which services are being designed. Nothing is perfect, nothing ever can be. This is a country at war. But, we work globally in countries across the world. And in Ukraine, this is a unique case where stigma is being addressed, in small steps, in systematic steps, across the policy and practice framework.
Okay, who's next? Sir. If you could introduce yourself and keep your question brief, please.
Lagalushka Open Society Foundations. One question on reparations. Russia obviously is not going to pay, but Russia has frozen assets that the European Union has. So how about we try to use frozen assets that the European Union has to pay Ukrainian victims? Thank you.
Do you think it's possible? Anyone? Charo?
There is a huge discussion on that, and indeed the European Register for Damages has been set up for that very purpose, to come to a decision about how to use these frozen assets to eventually pay for the crimes that have been committed. I think Katrina may be able to cast more light on it, or maybe Christina, you can. I don't know enough about the process, but certainly there is something afoot already in order to use these funds and to deploy them.
Yes, and register of damages is, of course, one way how we can work in this process. And second, in November last year, our parliament adopted new laws about interim reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. It means now we are working on implementation documents of this law, and we will have special fund in our budget, and for example, European countries or other international organizations who will want help survivors of CRSV in Ukraine, they can share some funds to this special fund in our budget, and we will have opportunity pay compensation and reparation for survivors of CRSV.
And of course, opponents of the idea to use Russian funds to pay reparations, they say, well, we're the people or institutions holding the money. If we take something that belongs to somebody else and hand over to a third party, that undermines our financial credibility. So there's politics and there's money as well, reputations. Who's next? You, lady, please, Please introduce yourself and keep your question brief.
Dobry wieczór. Мене звати Jenny. I'm another MA student at King's. My question is, what contribution to justice, if we think about justice as not just being criminal justice and reparations, what contribution is the actual investigation and the naming of the perpetrators? We've seen a lot of really good investigations through open source intelligence organizations like Kiev Independent and many others. How much help does that give the victims?
I think Alexei mentioned this briefly. Would you like to answer that question, Alexei?
По-моему, отвечал, или я не совсем понял формулировку вопроса.
I think I answered, either I not quite understood the question.
Okay, let me repeat it and correct me if I got it wrong. So basically the question is, investigations and investigators, including the people in Ukraine, what sort of contribution they are making to bringing justice to victims of...
Specifically, the identification publicly of the perpetrators.
Specifically identifying the perpetrators. Does that help?
Ну, у нас слідчі проводять дуже
Our
багато роботи.
investigators are doing huge amount
Так як
of
сказала
work.
Чару, вже ми в
Just
стані
as Charu said,
війни,
we are in a state of work. There is a lack of personnel,
очень много
and
делает работы.
prosecutors together with police are doing huge work
И, ну, с этими
on
идентификациями там
identifying,
начались суды,
and
ну,
trials
а опять
started,
же, это
but
заочные
once again
суды.
they are trials
Тут я,
without
наверное,
accused
хотел
person
бы
being present.
отклониться к вопросу,
But
который до
I would
этого
probably
был,
like to return to
обсуждали.
previous question,
Ну, насколько эта безкарность была.
discussing
Я вам просто
impunity.
хотел бы сказать, ну,
I just
с
want
той
to say
стороны,
to
ну,
you,
со стороны человека,
from
которого
perspective of a
пытали.
person being tortured,
Тут, как
I
вам
don't know how to
объяснить?
explain
Меня
it to
пытали,
you.
они, ну, гениталии
I
говорили,
was tortured, I
стерилизовать
was
будут.
threatened that
Также
I'll
они
be
говорили, что это будет
sterilized.
детектор
Also, they
лжи.
promised
Также они говорили, это будет звонок к
that
Зеленскому,
they
Байдену. То
will
есть
use
и это и
different
было и
electrocution on
издевательство, и
me.
это в то же время
It,
было стирание моей,
it was
так, идентичности, да,
torturing me,
максимально.
and also
Ну
they
вот
tried
к
to
чему я
vanish
веду,
my
я
identity,
просто
just
хотел бы
wipe it
натолкнуть
out.
на мысль,
So what
насколько
I'm trying to
они
say,
это легко и просто
they were
делали,
doing it
и как один
so
из
easily,
этих
as
насильников
one
мне
of
как-то
those
сказал,
perpetrators
а мне за
said,
это ничто не будет. И
they
продолжал
won't do
веселиться.
anything to me.
Вот
And
вот
he
это
just
вот
continued having fun. So this
бескарность, и они знают,
impunity,
что
they
им ничего за
know
этого не будет,
that
и
they
оно ведет
won't be
только к
held
худшему и к
accountable.
худшему.
It
И
worsen and
эти
worsen the
коридорные, когда
situation.
приезжали, они, ну, если они еще, если так
And
можно сказать, не сильно издевались,
if
то через
at
буквально
first
неделю-полторы, когда ихние
wardens
начальники
were not
сидели, просто
very
смотрели, как они
cruel,
пытают людей.
Then later they turned into some kind of beast maniacs. This understanding of own impunity, it just led to bigger crimes and more cruel ones. And our prosecutors and investigators, they're doing massive work. They collaborate with us, with different organizations. Of course, there are a lot of problems which need to be solved, but once again, we are in a state of war. As it was said, everything is unique in our situation. We are doing everything at one go, fighting for justice.
Just to add one detail, when it comes to impunity and naming, there's one Russian soldier or possibly unit commander who was named by Russian investigators as possibly someone who was involved in war crimes in Ukraine. And that person was sitting right behind Vladimir Putin at the Victory Day parade on Friday. Okay. At the very back, the gentleman in the suit. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruben Rees from the Foreign Office. Friday's Lviv statement marked the latest step in strengthening international mechanisms to support justice for Ukraine. And we know that the wheels of justice turn slowly. So what can prosecutors and civil society in Ukraine do to ensure that witnesses are sustainable, are kept engaged, and stay with the process right till the very end, no matter how long it might take? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I would say honesty. Honest discussions with victim survivors on how long the process will take, what it will entail, how much is expected from them, how little can possibly come to them from this process is the fundamental grain on which trust will be built. And, you know, survivors are not fragile people. They've endured the worst and they have survived it. They can take it. They can take the truth. So be straight with them and tell them what a tough and long process it's going to be. But at the same time, support them. So I would say, you know, the absence of medical care, the absence of mental health care is going to be one of the fundamental issues which will, you know, bring this justice project unraveling, which will unravel the justice project, because people will just not have the strength to stay with it, as you rightly point out. Documentation, safe documentation of information and preserving of data, forensic data in particular, which is a weakness in the system, needs to be built. The good thing is, all the documentation is happening now when it's live. This hasn't happened before. So, you know, we have a huge opportunity here. But I think part of the opportunity is also going to be to work with victims and ensure that they're supported. Christine?
Next question. You sir, in the yellow tie, please.
Patrick Bosch, I'm a barrister here in London. My question is, there's a lot of talk about bringing people like Putin to justice. And of course, that seems far off and unrealistic. I mean, he's not the youngest person around either. But what about actually prosecuting some of the people who get captured by Ukrainian forces? Is that something that anyone has thought about? I would have thought that many of the soldiers, for example, who were captured might have participated in war crimes, and maybe prosecuting them would be a place to start. It might help build a more nuanced picture of the facts on the ground, as it were. And also it might send a signal to other Russian forces that there are potential consequences for engaging in these acts.
One for you, Christina.
Yes, maybe Katerina will add few words, but I won't say, Katerina mentions that now we have more 130,000 open criminal cases against Russian soldiers who committed different war crimes. Some of them, of course, now is in captivity or detention in Ukraine because they committed war crimes, some of them not. But we as lawyers, we understand that it's not possible investigate of all these thousand cases on the national level against each concrete soldiers. Yes, we have to think about commander's responsibility, and of course Putin, but not only he. We can talk about other military leaders who take decision and who agree all war crimes which committed in Ukraine against Ukrainian people. And it's very important talk about work, and now I know the General Prosecutor Office work together with other prosecutors from other countries, and they investigate and open more big cases which include different facts of war crime cases, and try investigate these cases against commanders who take this decision.
Just a small addition that Russian POWs captured by Ukrainians, they are being interviewed by the investigators and prosecutors, and if there are viable allegations, of course, the criminal proceedings are being opened. The issue here is that oftentimes the prisoners of war exchange and the exchange of the detained civilians is highly political, and it has been a case where Russia would demand that certain captured Russians who are indicted or who are suspect members in the criminal proceedings, that they be returned to Russia in return for Ukrainian POWs or civilians held there. And this might be a big bargaining chip actually for Russia. I have spoken with a number of Ukrainian POWs, including the members of the Azov battalion, who, as you know, are particularly harshly mistreated, as to what would be their preference of them as persons who have been through the most horrific experiences there, whether they would tolerate the closure of criminal proceedings against certain Russians who may be physically there, because Ukraine, most of those cases, is trying in absentia. And the POWs I have engaged with have told me that the most important thing is to get our people back physically, because they're being horrendously abused there. So I would just say that this exchange of civilians and POWs question might be as an impediment to the criminal proceedings, quite a few of them that we have with the charged persons there physically in the dock, because the majority, again, of the proceedings are in absentia in Ukraine.
Next. Sir, at the back, please.
Thank you. My name is James Nixie. I run the Russia and Eurasia program here. Cherry, thank you for bringing this to us. It was all you're doing, so I appreciate that. But forgive me if I have a question for your Ukrainian co-panelists. So Alexei, Christina, and Katerina, considering the unremitting cruelty that the Kremlin and the Russian army have inflicted upon you, Alexei, and your compatriots, Katerina and Christina, can you even envisage a Russia which you might be able to have a normal relationship with? Or is it so horrific and so real and so current and so painful, but actually that is beyond your comprehension? I would completely understand if that were to be the case. Or can you see something in the future where your children and your children's children can have there can be a relationship of between normal neighbors? Or is it just, has it gone too far right now?
I hear this question quite often, and I am often asked. And I would ask also question, are you ready to forgive a raper of your wife or your child or your raper? Would you be ready to forgive this person? Would you be ready to shake hands? Would you like your kids to communicate with his kids? These are words of me being a survivor, not a politician, but a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence?
I would probably think about the steps which it would be great to see Russia doing. For instance, the Canadian or Australian or New Zealand colleagues, when they make public presentations, they would oftentimes speak in an indigenous language, acknowledging that they are speaking from the land previously belonging to indigenous peoples, horrendously abused by the newcomers. If Russia conducts something like this, if Russia has a truth-seeking commission for its own good, and of course also for the good of Ukraine and Belarusian people and other nations and indigenous nations abused by the Imperial Soviet and nowadays Russia, I think then it would be easier to think about the modalities of coexistence. But as of now, with all respect to some civil society, meager civil society leaders in Russia, I haven't seen this principal citizen stance coming from them. And if anything, a number of UN special rapporteurs have commented on Russia's persecution of historians who try to reveal the crimes of the Stalinist regime, including in Sandarmoh, where Ukrainian Rastrelyanna Vedrodina executed Renaissance artists were also buried. So we haven't seen neither from the state, nor so far from the meager civil society, the desire to reflect on that. And I think this desire would be needed for me to start thinking about coexisting with them normally.
We have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
Bate Doms, chairman of the British Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. I'm also a lawyer practicing between London and Kiev. Regarding the comment on frozen Russian assets, it seems that the best opportunity for recovery for the people who've been injured, as well as for Ukraine for war atrocities, is by going against those assets. We hear in London over and over, well, the banks can't do that, it would hurt their reputation. The banks don't turn over the assets. The banks simply have the assets. In the legal proceedings, you attach those assets and you enforce against them. The problem is to be sure that sovereign immunity for those assets is waived as it was for the Nazis, and it should be waived.
Any comments in the last minute of our discussion?
Maybe I want to add about how we can, about responsibility and how we, if we are ready, continue communication with Russian people and etc. I think I agree with Katarina, and I want to add to this that it's very important to understand when people will not really take responsibility for all crimes, it means that they don't understand what they did, and we cannot continue any communication. If people say, yes, we was guilty, we know this, and we are ready to take responsibility for all of these crimes, we can talk about communication in the future and thought how we can think about reparation, recovery, etc. in other countries.
Well, this brings our discussion to a conclusion. Please allow me to thank you all for coming and our online audience for watching and sending in their questions. And please join me in a round of applause for our panelists and Alexei and Kherson to applaud their courage.